Imagine living in fear in your own home. Imagine going to sleep at night not knowing if you're going to make it through the night. Now imagine staying in that danger and keeping your children in that danger simply because you cannot afford to leave. 1 in 4 women in the US will experience severe domestic violence in their lifetime. 1 in 4 is a national crisis. The number one reason survivors stay in abusive situations is because they can't afford to leave. And the number one reason they return is they don't have the financial resources to stay safe. I'm Sonya Passi. I'm the founder of FreeFrom, a national organization that's on a mission to create pathways to financial security and long-term safety for survivors of domestic violence. A recent study found that domestic violence will cost a female survivor an average of $103,000 across their lifetime. And on top of that, in 98% of cases of domestic violence, in addition to there being physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, there's also financial abuse, which means not being allowed to work, losing your job because of the abuse, coerced or fraudulent debt, not having access to cash or bank accounts. We have a client right now, her abuser took out 7 credit cards in her name, had them sent to his brother's house, and between him and his brother, they racked up $17,000 of debt in her name. We have another client who was actually the sole breadwinner in her house, but she never had more than a few dollars in her pocket because her abuser would pick up her paycheck at the end of the week. And when one time she went to him and said that she needed money for tampons, he said, by my calculation, you have 6 days before your period. So either you're lying to me or you need to go figure it out. And what all of this means is that we have this incredibly tight nexus between gender-based violence and financial insecurity. So let's just recap. There are 2 options for 1 in 4 women in the US. The first is to be physically, psychologically, and financially abused. The second is to leave the abuse with an average of $103,000 in costs, no job, no cash, poor credit, and a tremendous amount of financial trauma. So what are we doing about it? Well, historically, very little. The domestic violence movement is completely at capacity, just putting out fires, making sure there are enough shelter beds, making sure there aren't guns in the homes of known abusers, making sure that survivors can get restraining orders. But the result is that we are putting Band-Aids on a systemic problem. So we have this incredibly innovative asset-building movement over here, and a very stagnant domestic violence movement over here, and there's no communication between the two. And what we need is for the asset-building movement to be responsive to the needs of 1 in 4 women in the US, and a domestic violence movement that's integrating financial capacity building work into their everyday work. We're taking a very holistic approach at FreeFrom, and we've got kind of a 3-pronged strategy. The first strategy is what I like to call B2B, integrating financial capacity building work into the domestic violence movement. The reality in the movement is that the people that are working day in, day out with survivors are often survivors themselves. They're making about $35,000 a year, they're working 12-hour days, and they are themselves overworked, underpaid, and financially insecure. So they're not checking their client's credit with them when they walk into a shelter because they haven't checked their own credit in a few years. And if they have a tremendous amount of fear and shame around what to do about it. And so our methodology of teaching is to support the people working in the movement in building their own financial capacity through e-learning, through one-on-one financial coaching. And we're offering a year of technical assistance to everyone that comes through our training program so that they have time to learn and integrate this into their work. So far, we've got 60 organizations in our pipeline from across 10 states. 20 years ago, if you were a survivor of domestic violence and you wanted to get a restraining order, you had to go figure it out yourself. Like, there was nowhere in the movement that you could go for help with that. You had to find yourself an attorney. And so survivors almost never got restraining orders. But what the movement realized, and community organizations realized, and funders realized, was that people needed this. They needed this protection. And now, you cannot go anywhere as a survivor of domestic violence and not have very quick access to pro bono restraining order services. And we need to do the same for financial capacity building. As a survivor, when you're going to a shelter or a YWCA or a legal aid or wherever it may be, in addition to getting your restraining order and filing your victims of crime report and getting access to public assistance, you need to also be getting support in building income, protecting your finances, repairing your credit, healing from the financial trauma of being financially abused. Our second strategy is what I call B2C, which is going directly to survivors. In LA, there are 500,000 women who've experienced domestic violence, and there are 2,500 shelter beds. So what that tells you that if shelters are the center of the domestic violence movement, we're not nearly reaching everyone that's experienced this. And that doesn't mean that they don't need support. That just means that they're doing it without any help. So we're using technology to reach survivors. In January, we launched an online self-help compensation tool that survivors can use to figure out exactly how they can get compensation for the medical bills, the property damage, lost wages, relocation costs. And it talks them through step by step how to go through that process. Since the end of January, we've had 100,000 users, which tells you, A, the power of technology, and B, how many people actually need this service. We're in the early stages right now of creating an app to support survivors in financial recovery, with daily affirmations about abundance and money mindset and healing that financial trauma, with goal setting. It's kind of like mental health meets financial coaching meets goal setting, but made for people who have experienced financial abuse and financial trauma. Because the apps that we have out there are all a one-size-fits-all model, and that's not going to work. The last thing we're doing is policy reform. The statute of limitations for survivors in 47 states is 1 to 2 years. What that means is, if you're in an abusive situation and your abuser punches you, you have a year from that moment to sue him or her. It might be 8 years from then before you're actually in a position to leave, and all of a sudden your claims are void. We worked with Colorado this year to increase their statute of limitations from 1 year to 6 years, and in the case of traumatic brain injury, to 20 years. Because more often than not, it takes a while for you to even realize that that's what happened to you. We also need to work on policy reform around credit. Yeah, we do. We really, really do. For survivors of domestic violence who have experienced fraudulent debt, in order to remove that debt from their credit score, they not only need a police report saying that they are a survivor of domestic violence, but that police report needs to also say that as part of that domestic violence, their abuser committed identity fraud against them. 3 out of 5 survivors say they would never go to the police because they're scared for their safety if they do. And more than that, we've heard from our legal aid partners that LAPD, NYPD, Phoenix PD, and others refuse to provide such police reports in cases of domestic violence because they can't be sure that the survivor didn't in some way benefit from that debt. But in other areas of domestic violence policy, we've moved away from the police report requirement. It used to be that to break a lease immediately or to keep your address confidential, you needed to have a police report. But now, a letter from an advocate or a social worker or a case manager will do in place of that. And it's not a stretch to do the same for credit. A survivor will go back to the abuse an average of 7 times before they finally leave. And every single time they go back, the risk to their life increases, and the impact on the health and well-being of their children worsens. Growing up in a home with domestic violence is a key indicator for teen suicide and depression, youth incarceration, and teen dating violence. So let's bridge that gap in services so that when a survivor leaves, they have the support and the services to heal, rebuild, and never have to go back. Thank you.